Hi, by now you've started reading about basic descriptive statistics. The purpose of this video is to show you how to use Excel to make your life a lot easier when summarizing your data. In other words, when making tables and charts. So let's start with an Excel database which includes information about customers that apply for a credit card. You'll notice in this Excel file that each row contains information for a particular customer. And each column contains a variable, a piece of information about the customer. Something like annual income, or number of people in the household, or number of years of post-high school education, or hours of week watching TV, or gender. And eventually, the company wants to predict credit card charges. That will be based on the other variables. So we need to go ahead and summarize the data, and I'm going to start by summarizing the data on gender. It's just too much in this column to just get a feel for just by looking down this column, which has 125 people's information in it. So the way we're going to summarize this is with a table called a pivot chart. I'm going to insert a pivot table, and I am going to indicate that I want to put my table into a new worksheet. And here we go. Of course, this does not exactly look like the table that you wanted, does it? We're going to have to do a few more things to create our table. So what I'd like to do is to grab the variable name and drag it down into the row box. And notice up here that female and male shows up. Those are the two possible categories for our qualitative variable gender. And I'll take gender now again in this pivot table field area and bring it down to values. And when I lift up the mouse, you will notice that count of gender now shows. So what we have here is something called a frequency table. And it looks okay, but what's this blank thing here? What I'm going to do is to insert a couple of columns in here because otherwise you won't be able to see what I'm doing in just a moment. Now that I've done that, I'm going to click on this arrow and I'm going to unclick blank. So there's the table. It looks a little bit nicer than what it looked like before. And again, that's a frequency table. Now, sometimes it would be nice to see this as percentages or proportions. In other words, what I may want to have is something called a relative frequency. So what is a relative frequency? It's simply a proportion. And I can get that by saying equal, which is the way I start all my formulas, 55 divided by my 125 people that I have. And so what this tells me is that 0.44 of the people are female, and if I have equals 70 divided by 125, that tells me that 0.56 of the group is male. Well, that's fine, but sometimes it's easier to see it as a percent. And so what I could do is to go ahead and highlight and come up here and click on the percent. And that gives me 44% versus 56% in terms of female and male. Of course, there is an easier way of doing this. If I click back into this table, you'll notice that the pivot table field section shows up again. And I can either click down here in the values section and pick value field settings, or if I just right-click in this column, I can pick up value field settings. I'm going to indicate I want the computer to show values as, but instead of no calculation, I'm going to ask it for percent of column total. And there you go. So that's two different ways of getting basically a relative frequency distribution, or the percentages. Now, it may be kind of nice to form a graph of this qualitative data, and the two kinds of graphs that I probably want to be looking at making are a bar graph and a pie chart. So first of all, a bar chart. I'll highlight my data, I will insert, and I will take this horizontal chart. I can do a two-dimensional bar or a three-dimensional bar. I'll just pick a nice simple two-dimensional bar, and that looks nice, except total right here, I can probably get rid of. And instead of saying total up here, I probably ought to type the word gender. Now you'll notice it does not yet show up down here. It does show up here. But as soon as I hit the Enter key, it shows up as I want it. And one more thing, do I really want to see this stuff right here? Probably not. So if I right-click and I hide all the field buttons on the chart, that will get rid of everything that I don't want to see. And so that's a nice graph. Now, what if I want to see a pie chart instead? I can right-click and change the chart type, and I'm changing it from a bar to a pie chart. And there are various kinds of pie charts I can use. I can do a regular pie chart or a 3D pie or an exploding pie. I'm just going to simply take a simple pie and say OK. And now if I want to, I can do some special things to it. If I click on Design, I notice that I can put in the numbers, the percentages, and that looks a little nicer. Or I can put in this kind of a graph or something that looks like this. Play around with it. You've got a lot of different options. So that's how we deal with qualitative data. I do want to point out that for you Mac people, you're not going to be doing an insert pivot table, but rather you'll look at the data and then do your pivot table. So play around with that. Okay, so I've dealt with a qualitative variable. How about a quantitative variable like annual charges? How would I summarize that? I'm going to again do an insert pivot table. Again, for you Mac people, it's a data pivot table. And at this point, again, I'll put it into a new worksheet. Again, it doesn't look anything like I want to see until I click annual charges and drag it down into rows, and annual charges and drag it down into values. Well, that is a frequency table, but it doesn't look really good because there's so many categories here. Take a look. So how do I make it more useful for a frequency table, which really ought to have between 5 and 15 categories in it, so that I don't summarize too much or too little? Well, if I right-click on the data itself and click Group, that will give me an option of creating a grouping starting from 0 going up to 35,000. That's my minimum and maximum. And this is going to do it by 10,000s. And I'm going to click on OK. All right, well that's fine, but I would point out that there's so many items in just a couple of categories that it's really not summarizing very much. So perhaps what I ought to do is right-click and group again. And this time, instead of summarizing by 10,000s, which is a little bit too much, let's go ahead and summarize by 5,000s. Well, that may look a little bit better, but again, a little bit too heavy here. Let me try this one last time. And this time, I'll do it by 2,500s. Again, there's no right or wrong answer. It's just a way of making it look useful to you. Okay, that looks just a little bit better. There is still one small problem here, though, and that is that you'll notice there's a gap between the 27,500 and the 32,500. That's telling you that there's an outlier. So what do? I'm going to right-click, and this time I'm going to choose Pivot Table Options. And the Pivot Table option that I'm going to look at is for empty cells show as 0. Now, this still isn't going to quite give you what you want, but let me click on OK. Nope, didn't change anything. So one more time, right-click, and this time click on Field Settings. And I'll go into Layout and Print, and this time it will be Show Items with No Data. And voila. Now I do have my zeros in the items with no data, but I have all of my data points spread out a little bit better. And that's my frequency table. How do I graph it? I graph it by highlighting my data, inserting, but this time I'm going to insert a histogram or a column chart. That's what I do for quantitative data, which is numerical data. That's what we're looking at. I'll take a simple two-dimensional column chart. There we go. Again, I'll get rid of my total. Instead of having total, I'm going to say total annual charges in dollar signs. And if I right-click and say hide all field buttons on the chart, that will get rid of that. And there's my graph. So what we've just seen is how to summarize qualitative data and quantitative data. We've looked at making pivot charts, we've looked at doing graphs like bar charts and pie charts, and also histograms. And we'll continue doing some descriptive statistics in another video. Thanks.